Hello there, my fellow laser brains and nerf herders. I do not know about you, but I am still coming down from the high of having seen Rogue One recently. Those last 15 minutes scarred me in the best way. Like, struck me down, but made me more powerful than I could have imagined. But in talking about Rogue One, I keep hearing two other movies come up for comparison, and it gave me the idea for this video. Surprisingly, they're not Star Wars movies. They're Suicide Squad and Guardians of the Galaxy. And there's a reason for that. You see, all of those films are in some ways ripping off the 1967 World War II favorite, The Dirty Dozen. That movie's about a group of not your typical heroes being tasked with what is not only an impossible mission, but most likely a suicidal mission. And considering that Rogue One is heavily influenced by World War II style films and is actually set in a multiple world war, it feels like an even more direct connection. And the thing is, the filmmakers know they're stealing this setup. They do it on purpose, and they should. Dirty Dozen is a classic for a reason. It's like Pablo Picasso said, I have no idea what human beings look like. But also the other thing, good artists copy, great artists steal. You take from those that have done it right and you build off of that. So here's the list of the long tradition of things Star Wars ripped off. And yes, I know some of these are actually just gonna be homages, but interestingly, there are some things on this list that George Lucas denies having taken from, but you might not believe him when you see the similarities. And also, there are some surprises in here in general, like something that got lifted from the DC comic book universe. But alright, let's get into it. Roughly in order from smaller references and inspirations to the most cited, maybe most stolen from source material that's out there. Let's start with a quick little one, and that's our buddy C-3PO. He's one of the most iconic robots in film history, and you can probably draw him from memory, but I don't know that you'd be able to do the same for his inspiration, Maria, from Fritz Lang's 1927 sci-fi expressionistic film, Metropolis. They're basically gender-swapped twins. Also, both of their creators have lost parts of their arms and had to replace them with cyborg hands and black gloves. I'll say, by the way, nearly every sci-fi movie can trace some part of itself back to Metropolis. Let's hop over to the prequels for a moment. Yeah, we are gonna be talking about all of the Star Wars movies. In The Phantom Menace, there's a pod race scene, and while the pod racing stuff is often considered one of the most annoying additions to the Star Wars lore, rewatching the Anakin and Sebulba race scene and realizing it's almost a shot-for-shot remake of the chariot race scene in 1959's Ben-Hur, it actually makes you appreciate it a little bit more. They both also have shady betting going on before the race, and the villain commenting on the hatred that is starting to rise up in the hero. Also, this explains the kind of like ridiculous moment where the pod racers get their like engines locked up together. It's mimicking the chariot wheels from Ben-Hur. Up next, let's talk about the editing of one of the best, most effective parts of the prequels. That's the Order 66 sequence, or the mass execution of the Jedi in Revenge of the Sith. This sequence is directly influenced by a very similar set of scenes in one of the best movies of all time, The Godfather. In that movie, Michael's watching the baptism of his nephew as he's ascending into the role of being the Godfather, and it seems like a kind of peaceful transition. But behind the scenes, he's also ordered the execution of the heads of all the other mafia families, installing himself as the supreme mafia leader. These scenes are intercut the exact same way in Star Wars, the establishment of the Galactic Empire, which also is treated like something to celebrate, as the Chancellor ascending into his position of power, while behind the scenes it's his Order 66, and it has him taking out his enemies. Up next, let's jump back over to the original trilogy and talk about Yoda. Now, ever since Star Wars, Yoda has become one of the most ripped off characters ever, with so many wise mythical beings bestowing knowledge on the Chosen One, and usually they speak kind of strangely, and pretty often they have a really long extended death scene that has a lot to do with them finally being able to let go because the hero is ready. But really, that wasn't Yoda's story first. It was from the 1937 Frank Capra film Lost Horizon. The Yoda equivalent there is the High Lama, and you can really see it when you see that his death scene with Robert Conway is nearly shot for shot the same thing as Luke and Yoda in their scene. Sticking with characters for a moment, let's talk the most famous Star Wars character of all, Darth Vader. Now right here I'm gonna tell you, this is one of the examples of a property that George Lucas claims was not an inspiration for his character, but let's check it out anyway. There's a 1938 movie serial called The Fighting Devil Dogs, and in it, there's a villain known as the Lightning. And the Lightning is actually a really big deal because he was the first costumed villain in film history. And that costume looks very similar to what would become Vader's costume. It also kind of looks like a black version of Boba Fett's costume, actually. The Lightning also has similar powers to Darth Vader. And then on top of that, working underneath the Lightning are a bunch of soldiers that wear identity-hiding white costumes, and I mean, come on, these are stormtroopers. Oh, and they are both frequently compared to Nazis. All right, moving on. This next one, in contrast, is not so much debated. George Lucas is a huge fan of David Lean, and he loved his 1962 film Lawrence of Arabia, so much so that he often used it as an example of the cinematographical choices he wanted to make throughout Star Wars. As a kind of thank you, Lucas chose to shoot a scene of Anakin and Padme as a shot-for-shot remake of a scene from that movie. And even at the exact same location, actually, the Plaza de España in Seville. So let's jump now real quick to the end of A New Hope, where Luke and the other rebel pilots are doing the trench run, and they have to fire at that perfect moment into the perfect spot to destroy the ship. Now, what if I told you there's a 1955 movie called The Dam Busters that plays out the exact same way, except the pilots are in the British Royal Air Force and they're destroying a massive German dam. Now, while Lucas has also admitted that the movie 633 Squadron inspired a lot of this scene, there are actually some direct quotes from the battle in The Dam Busters that show up again in A New Hope.
It's too late to get home. It's too late.
Now, I'm not saying George Lucas is like hiding this either. It's just crazy how the lines even line up with that movie. And anyway, here's your best connection. A New Hope cinematographer Gilbert Taylor was the special effects guy on The Dam Busters. He hired him just to get that exact scene into his movie. Okay, now quickly I just want to share two smaller references to some really classic films. First up, this one comes from a choice made by an actor because, as it turns out, Jeremy Bulloch, the man under the Mandalorian mask, based his entire portrayal of Boba Fett completely on Clint Eastwood's The Man with No Name from The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Specifically, you can notice it in the physicality of the two characters. But the maybe easier to see character model is from the movie Casablanca. Humphrey Bogart's Rick is Han Solo. They both even use that same condescending term of endearment, kid. Actually, watch these two movies back to back and you'll see that, yeah, they're very similar, but you'll also pick up on a few more lifted bits from Casablanca. Specifically, the way they show that seedy criminal underbelly of the galaxy. Not only is there a cantina in Casablanca that is also a place to hide away from the authorities with a fun band full of all kinds of weird people, but they're both located in towns that are all about characters trying to stay under the radar, but are also secretly badass criminals with complex histories. And in those side villains, you'll find maybe the meanest reference on this entire list. Signor Ferrari, the fez-wearing overweight man, he's a leader of illegal activity in the region. He's really powerful, very respected. He's totally the inspiration for Jabba the Hutt. Like, I'm not kidding. In early designs, Jabba the Hutt wore a fez. This poor guy, like, could not have been flattered watching this movie. All right, we're starting to get into the heavy hitters, the properties that Star Wars lovingly ripped off to be the saga we know it is today. And one of the huge ones is Dune. Dune is full of moisture farming and crazy obese aliens and mind control, and aura spice was something that Leia was actually smuggling in an early draft of the script rather than Death Star plans, and spices like that are totally huge in Dune. Also, the script for Dune was actually being passed around a lot in the same time that George Lucas was a young screenwriter looking for ideas for Star Wars, so the timelines do line up fairly well. There are also a lot more connections between these two, but I'll share real quick spoilers. They both have huge reveals between the hero and villain to reveal their father and son, or grandfather and grandson in Dune. Up next, a biggie, but one I'm gonna separate from the rest because it's not a film or a book, really. It's The Legend of King Arthur, and it is a huge inspiration for the story of Star Wars. They are both tales about young men who are destined for greatness that have to be hidden for their own protection. They both are brought to a magical sword where a wise old magic man explains the significance of it to them. They then go on to have a father-son battle with their antagonist having a proclivity for wearing black in the dark side of magic, by the way. And here's something more fun. The parallels still keep applying with only slight adjustments, whether you're talking about Luke as King Arthur and Vader as the villain Mordred and Obi-Wan as Merlin, or in the prequels with Anakin as Arthur and Qui-Gon as Merlin and the Emperor as Mordred, or even in the new movies with Rey as Arthur and Han in the Merlin role and Kylo Ren as Mordred, who, by the way, actually looks a lot like Mordred. And bonus, in that one, you also get the Lady of the Lake in Maz Kanata, who lives on a lake and whose story is also about reconnecting Arthur to his sword. Also, here's another non-movie inspiration for you, and it's the DC Comics property I mentioned earlier. Star Wars actually has a lot in common, like maybe too much, with DC's New Gods saga. It's all about a prophesied hero who has to overcome the dark side and restore peace to the universe, but also that hero's unaware that the villain also happens to be his father. Oh, also, there's a mystical, magical astro force that the youngling grows up to become a powerful wielder of. So yeah, this is New Gods, and that is not Luke I'm talking about, it's Orion. And aside from wielding astro force in the universe, there's another force that binds them all together, and it's called the Source. Not the Force, the Source. Of course, of course. Oh, and his dad is literally named Darkseid. Like spelled differently, but you know, Darkseid. Now, rumor has it that someone actually talked to George Lucas about this before he made Star Wars and warned him about all the similarities, and then he just tried a Jedi mind trick on them and ran away, or just ignored them or something. I have no idea. All right, we're now at the final 3 biggest influences to the saga that is Star Wars. First up, it's not a movie actually, it's another director, and this guy is no stranger to getting ripped off. It's Akira Kurosawa, and Kurosawa is taught in every film class ever because this guy mastered battle scenes in film and explored fascinating missions in war, and Star Wars totally references his works a ton, but so do like almost all other things. Game of Thrones takes from him all the time. Real quick, watch The Hidden Fortress if you want to see a movie where 2 bumbling helpers, who are the comic relief of the movie and who constantly bicker, they must help a princess on her mission to restore peace to their land. They are R2-D2 and C-3PO, except they're human farmhands. Lucas actually totally admits this is where he got those characters from. The Cantina Brawl from A New Hope is also taken from Yojimbo, it's another Kurosawa movie. And then Kurosawa's Dersu Uzala has 2 scenes which George Lucas just yanked right up. One is a blizzard scene that features a military captain collapsing and his partner dragging him to safety, and it's all exactly Hoth and Han and Luke. And the other has those same characters looking out over the horizon, watching the setting sun, and it's the inspiration for that classic Luke blinding himself staring at 2 suns in Tatooine. Alright, so that's it for Kurosawa, but up next is the story that most nerds would say was a direct inspiration for Star Wars, but I have it as number 2 on my list, and that's Flash Gordon. George Lucas actually very publicly pitched a Flash Gordon movie before Star Wars, but he could not get the rights to it, so his backup plan was basically, okay, I'll just make my own version of the exact same thing. First off, they've got their own version of Cloud City, except it's called The Court of the Skymen. Though Flash Gordon also ripped that off from Aristophanes, so maybe let's let that one slide a little. But plot points are also lifted straight from here. For instance, the hero has to infiltrate the enemy base, and he gets in the enemy's costume to get in. Lots of characters and monsters come straight out of Flash Gordon. Chewbacca is kind of in there, but he's like the prince of his people, Prince Dune. The technology is really similar. And hey, you know what? Doesn't this upward opening text crawl look familiar? But okay, here's why I don't have Flash Gordon as number 1, even though it has so many of the same things as Star Wars. That's because really, they're both ripping off, at number 1, the biggest inspiration for Star Wars, John Carter of Mars. No, not that crappy movie from a few years back. The original source material of that. The famous stories of Edgar Rice Burroughs, who also wrote Tarzan, is the inspiration for a lot of space travel movies actually. But you want a nice specific example? Anytime you see an arena battle scene with some huge alien or crazy beast, that's from John Carter. You'll remember the Attack of the Clones version of this one with Anakin and Obi-Wan. But way more obvious to me is the Martian princess, Deja Thoris from John Carter. She's just a princess who's leading a rebellion against the evil regime and trying to restore peace to her people. Oh, and sometimes she looks crazy hot in a golden bikini. I'm sure you've seen that somewhere else. But again, it's so many things. Instead of banthas, we have banths, but they're the same kind of animals that are used by sand people. We literally have the word Sith in there, except in John Carter it refers to like these ferocious space wasps. Actually, we have lots of words that sound like Star Wars words. There's Jed, Jedak, and Jedara are all titles, clearly inspiration for the word Jedi. Padwar is a lower ranking officer, like a Padawan. And yeah, more characters, like the Green Tarks are the furry Wookiees in Star Wars, and Obi-Wan is John Carter. They're both captains in an army that technically does not exist anymore, and now they live as like poor men who only have their morals to guide them toward good. And it's full of sword fighting, and they literally say they have speeder bikes at some point. So yeah, it's very, very familiar. But you know what? That's fine. Lion King is Hamlet. Oh Brother, Where Art Thou is the Odyssey. The stories we tell today, even in our own lives, all take cues from the stories we've heard. There's a reason for this. Humans have gotten really good at storytelling. Like, we're way better than monkeys. And it's why I'm still somehow pumped for a new Spider-Man movie, even though it's exactly the same kid we've seen before. It's about how the story is told, what details they go into or add, and the tone can be completely different even if the plot is the same. Comedies and dramas often have the same exact story, actually. You can just laugh at the painful stuff in one of them. So all right. That's it for me. Hit me up on Twitter at Fimo if you want to discuss these or point out some I missed. And you know what? Let's be fair to George Lucas. Let me know in the comments what movies have since ripped off Star Wars. Here's one. I love you all. Good night and good luck. I stole that.
I smell a lie.
There's now word that Batfleck might not be so keen on directing the Batman movie anymore.
You'll both be interested to know that 2017 is going to be full of some of the most exciting nerd properties that our geeky little hearts have ever had.